Welcome to tonight's webinar, Beliefs Matters. My name's Leonie Goodwin and I work at Sea Change, a research and values-driven business working on the human and social dimensions of transformation to sustainability. We're really delighted that so many of you could join us for this, our fourth webinar in the You Matter webinar series. And each of our webinars addresses a particular chapter or topic in Karen O'Brien's new book, You Matter More Than You Think, Quantum Social Change in Response to a World in Crisis. So tonight's topic, Beliefs Matters, will be a fascinating exploration into the role beliefs play in quantum social change, including our meaning making and sense making, and whether and how we engage with climate change. We've gathered an exciting panel of speakers to explore and inspire you tonight, and maybe get you thinking in new ways about beliefs, intention, and agency. But first, some practical things. Could everyone please mute themselves when they're not talking? And just to give you an idea of the flow of the webinar, we'll be starting with short presentations from Karen and our guests, and then we'll briefly take some questions and comments. We'll then split into small groups for a discussion for around 15 minutes with some questions you can discuss, and then we'll come back for a longer interactive discussion in the main room where we'll take some questions and reflections and comments. If you'd like to raise a question during the webinar or comment, please type it into the chat, and you can find that function at the bottom of your screen. So also to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and we'll be sending the link out after the call. So now I'd love to hand over to Karen. Karen O'Brien is a professor of human geography at the University of Oslo in Norway and co-founder of Sea Change. And she's passionate about inspiring people to engage in equitable and sustainable transformations and the potential quantum thinking offers for enriching our perspective of what's possible. So over to you, Karen. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Leonie, and thanks everybody for joining tonight. It's really nice to see everybody for another webinar. And I'm just going to share my screen and give a brief introduction to this idea of beliefs matter. And let me get this. And this is the fourth chapter in a book manuscript that I've made available since about June. And this is the fourth webinar in the series. And what I'm trying to do is really open up an inquiry about what quantum physics and especially quantum social science has to offer for our understanding of social change. And my hypothesis that I'm really exploring and interested in engaging with is that we are collectively underestimating our collective capacity for social change by thinking of ourselves as these very individual, separate, deterministic, in a very reductionist way. So I thought that beliefs matter fits in really well right now. We have a big election coming up in the United States, and we see society being very polarized. And this particular chapter, Beliefs Matter, is one that starts to put subjectivity or people into the equation of how the world works and how quantum physics is interpreted. And I just want to, in this chapter, which I think it's about probabilities, it's about, do you believe in climate change? Do you believe that you matter? And it's one of the chapters where I look at an interpretation of quantum physics known as cubism or quantum Bayesianism. And this is I think it's a really interesting interpretation because it's based on this idea of participatory realism, the fact that we actually influence our reality through our beliefs. And one of the, this book on cubism, which is very accessible, it says that Bayesian probability is a measure of an agent's personal degree of belief that an event will occur or that a proposition is true. And the principal thesis of cubism is simply that quantum probabilities are numerical measures of personal degrees of beliefs. In other words, beliefs matter. And so this advocacy for participatory realism recognizes that potentially every particle along with every agent is a participant in the creation of the universe. And so it's not just that scientists are just these observers and recorders of reality, but they actually participate in reality, and all of us participate in reality. So I think this is really important and exciting because it's showing us that, that every elementary quantum phenomena is an act of creation, and we're constantly, it's a very participatory approach. Now, many people will say, well, you don't even need, quantum physics to tell us this. There's many theories in the social sciences and the humanities and indigenous knowledge systems and wisdom traditions. We kind of know this, but it hasn't really penetrated the mainstream understandings. And I think that we see this now in an increasingly polarized world where, I'm always happy to see Q methodology is something based on quantum physics. And so this Q movement, QAnon, is really interesting. And I'm just, I find it fascinating and just, from just trying to figure out what's going on here. And in many ways, I think it is just a classical movement that places good versus evil, right versus wrong, us versus them, and that is really kind of fracturing society in the way that these classical paradigms do. And it's not just like that it's linked to Newtonian physics and everything, but this goes way back into human history. And I'm currently reading an amazing book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. And she points out that she says, when people have lived with assumptions long enough, passed down through generations as incontrovertible fact, they are accepted as the truths of physics, no longer needing even to be spoken. They are as true and as unremarkable as water flowing through rivers or the air that we breathe. And this idea that we, our beliefs kind of are, we're so subject to our beliefs that we don't actually see them, we can't look at them as objects, I think is really important, and it's really dangerous at this time when we have about 9 more years to address climate change and the sustainability development goals to meet the targets that we have set. We are in the decade that matters. And physicists like David Bohm have challenged that idea that that we're living in this very fragmentary world. He says what is primarily needed is a growing realization of the extremely great danger of going on with a fragmentary process of thought. And I think that is really important. And how do we transcend that? And one of the ways, and what we're going to talk about tonight with the following speakers, is is the ways that we can transcend that through meaning making and sense making. And right now, it seems like we're all living in our little bubbles, that we're kind of just getting the information and having our beliefs reinforced and reinforced again all the time. And we're not necessarily connecting with anybody else. So that's outside of our bubble. And that's a challenge. So, to make that connection, to actually not just make the connection, but to recognize that we are connected, we are entangled, is, I think, super important at this time. And so it's not just this polarization of society and, like, does climate change exist or does it not? But it's also the assumptions that we have in science about the future and how we respond to it. And, so the way we are seeing the problem, the assumptions we have about the problem influence the way we're going to resolve it. And this article was shown in a 2017 Guardian paper in the UK, and it says that the planet has just 5% chance of reaching the Paris climate goal. And it says we have a 1% chance of meeting the 1.5 degree goal. And this, I think, is very worrying if you're interested in climate change, and you would probably start to plan for a world that is 3 degrees, 4 degrees or more warmer if you read this headline and looked at the article. If you actually go to the research that the article is based on, it's based on an integrated assessment model, and you would look and you say, wait a minute, it's at the very, very end of the article, it says that our forecasting model does not explicitly incorporate future legislation that could change future emission. It is based on past emissions. In other words, it's extrapolating the past right into the future as if we have no agency or control over the politics of over energy politics. And it's based on it's not only based on past emissions, but we also have not accounted for the possibility that decreasing prices for alternative energy could cause a sudden massive shift to alternative energy. That would be speculative. So that in this idea that we can't speculate, we don't actually include possibilities and potentialities that are out of the purview of what we already believe and think. And in these models, you never think about like changing values, changing worldviews, changing beliefs about ourselves and our relation to nature and our relation to the future. So the Greta Thunbergs, the Extinction Rebellions, the Sunrise Movement, these are not included in the models. And this leads us to many people to kind of just giving up hope about the future. And a paper written by Jem Bendell on deep adaptation kind of summarizes it very concisely. He says, currently, I have chosen to interpret the information as indicating inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction. There's a growing community of people who conclude we face inevitable human extinction and treat that view as a prerequisite for meaningful discussions about the implications of our lives right now. And I think that these conclusions about inevitability, probability, and possibility are based on an assessment of the scientific literature for sure, and I'm very familiar with that literature, and I know that we're going to be facing really high risk impacts, and we are right now, as many people around the world have experienced. But it's also based on the lack of adequate response to the climate crisis. But the conclusions really reflect this classical interpretation of social change, where individuals are discrete and we're not necessarily considered conscious or entangled or capable of changing systems because we are those systems. So going back to quantum theory, it's fundamentally about agencies, actions, consequences, and expectations based on the beliefs we have. So just to sum up, beliefs really matter. And when we say, I don't believe in climate change, it's actually, that has enormous impacts for the future of the planet. Treat that as a belief rather than to look at the patterns and our understanding of that. But equally dangerous is, I don't believe I matter. These are powerful statements that really influence the future that we actually enact, and what quantum Bayesianism or cubism would say, how the wave function collapses. And so I think that when we dig deeper, we just start to see that a lot of these ideas are based on, this humans being separate from nature, separate from each other, separate from the world out there. And so the idea of participatory realism, the idea that we actually do matter, I think is really critical at this time, not just individually, but collectively. And with that, I want to pass the baton on to Gail Hochachka, who is a doctoral fellow at the University of Oslo. She's actually working as a PhD student with me on a project called Adaptation Connects, and the Connects stands for combining old and new knowledge to enable conscious transformations to sustainability. And Gail is really looking at how meaning making affects how we adapt to climate change. And I think a lot of her work resonates very well with this idea that beliefs really matter. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Gail, and then we will go from there. So welcome. And I should mention that Gail is actually based in Vancouver. She's a visiting fellow at the Social Ecological Systems Research Group at the University of British Columbia right now. So although she's working in the Oslo group on Zoom, she's in Vancouver right now.
Thank you, Karen. Wonderful to be here. So I'm going to share my screen. One sec. Hold on. Oh, 1 second here. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that opening, Karen. It's such fascinating stuff. So I'm going to build on that with some findings and reflections from my PhD dissertation research, and focus in on this participatory realism, or this enactment of how our beliefs end up co-enacting our world in very real ways. So I want to start by saying that climate change of many global issues, this one is particularly plastic. We construe it differently. We make meaning of it in different ways. And that's been a big part of my research. And I'll touch on that in a little bit here. But there's another component here that's also equally very fascinating, and that is, however we make meaning of climate change, there's also this way that we might feel about that. And the extent to which, as we might become comfortable with what it might mean, there's research that suggests we actually edit our thinking to conform with our prior beliefs based on often our self-identity or our culture. So that's actually occurring moment to moment for many people, and it's quite something. And a component of it is just how inundated we are at this present moment with things that are pulling for our attention. And so there's another body of research that looks at how when you're reading the news, you're often tracking, your attention is tracking for things you actually already believe. So in a sense, this is already a complicated space, even before we've come to the table to discuss what we should do about climate change. A lot has already happened. And so, we may like to think that we reason about climate change, but there's also this, what's called politically motivated reasoning. And so it's actually interesting for those of you who have been following the election processes in the States, the first of the political debates, the question posed to President Trump was, what do you believe about the science of climate change? And I thought that was just really interestingly presented to him. It wasn't, what are you going to do about it? Or, what are the policies? But what do you believe? And he ended up answering in this fascinating way from the perspective of someone like myself who researches this. He went to, I want clean water. I want crystal clean air. And then he collapsed that further into it's about forest management. And so right there, you can see demonstrated what I'm describing. First of all, there's this meaning making of climate change, where the complexity of that organization of meaning is fairly atomistic. He's not seeing it as an atmospheric system, he's seeing it as forest management. The object of awareness is concrete. The scope of time is really in the moment. So right away, like the complexity of meaning making is fascinating. But then secondly, what is also occurring in this very answer is a signaling to which group he's part of and how he wants to present that group. So that another term in the research is cultural cognition. There's what he might actually understand about climate change, but there's also a cultural overlay on that. So very interesting that once you start looking at this, you can really see it everywhere. Now, the little sidebar to this whole conversation that is really relevant to beliefs in this particular moment is the social media landscape that we are all in one way or another participating in. Even when you go to a Google search, it already is taking data from all of your feeds and based on where you're located, infilling, the autofill of your Google search. When you write climate change it will infill differently depending on your area. And so this is problematic because in addition to our meaning making, in addition to our politically motivated reasoning, we also have these external forces that are actually nudging us to essentially stay in our echo chambers, to stay in our own belief systems. And so this does lead, as they've done research on this, it does lead to polarization. And creates this is going to be one of our main dilemmas in the coming decade, I believe, is how do we sort through what matters centrally and what we actually think about something in the midst of these platforms that nudge our beliefs. So that's just some thinking. What my research has been doing is essentially turning toward what does climate change mean to me? And inviting people in my research to contemplate that. And then we used photography to contemplate what does climate change mean to me and actually presenting that through photography and then describing the photography. It's a process called photo voice. And so in a way, taking stock of all the beliefs and how that influences what we understand about climate change, the solution to that, if you will, is to actually turn even more toward it. And actually make visible your own belief. So you're not looking through your belief, but you're looking at it. So I wanna explain to you briefly how this went. And I'm realizing I don't have that much time, but I'd love to give you a sense of how this went. So of 60 photos that represented various beliefs and understandings about climate change, the group of coffee producers, so they produce coffee in an area of Central America, Guatemala, they came up with 10 common themes across these 60. So even though they were a diverse group of individuals, they could kind of hone in on, okay, these are 10 common themes in how we understand and relate with climate change. My own analysis of this, looking at a meaning-making process of developmental stages, found these like 6 very different stages of meaning-making were represented in this group. So this is really fascinating that, you know, so many different beliefs and understandings were represented in just one group of coffee producers. If we were to take one of those and just, as Karen was saying, what happens, you know, if we are agents participating in our world, what happens when we take one of these beliefs and kind of carry it through? How does then adaptation to climate change or responses to climate change look? Okay, so what I want to do is take one of these. So here is one of the answers was this. She called her photo the 2 faces of climate change. I'll just give you a moment to read this. And then in the big text in the second paragraph there, she says, I consider this the positive and negative of climate change, the 2 faces of climate change. So the photography exercise had her turn toward her belief. What does climate change mean to me? And then encounter this notion of climate change having a positive and a negative side. So just notice what that immediately does to your own awareness. Just, oh, okay, there's these 2 faces. So it immediately changes your own experience is my suggestion. In this case, her next photo was this one, aligning words with actions. And so she started to kind of draw this through into practice. And so she noticed at home, I saw all of the organic waste and thought, what a shame. I saw how it's decomposing, and one could actually use that, could take benefit from it. And so she started to make on her mom's land a place where she could compost this waste. And so for a long time had thought of this in the back of her mind, but through this process of turning toward her belief, ended up gathering up this compost and wanted to do that also in the office and in other parts of the community. So aligning words with actions was the title she gave the photo. So this group of producers, if we, you know, this is just one example of like making your belief visible and looking at it versus through it. This overall, these coffee producers carried this belief in a personal strength to overcome obstacles. So this is actually the same producer. She, reflecting on this quality, was describing, one must struggle in life to proceed forward. If something makes you fall, you don't stay fallen, you rise up. These are beliefs. You rise up. You show the rest of the world that you're different. So she's describing her belief. And what was interesting is that when I went to other regions, this is the kind of thing I saw. This is a different coffee producer here, and he's created a way to gather the rainwater from the top of the house, and it comes into a rain barrel. Just, you know, taking the limited things that he has around his house to make things work, to address the challenges that they're facing. So this sort of personal strength to overcome obstacles was really noticeable and part of how they did adaptation. The second belief that I wanted to raise here is a belief in collective organizing. So these individuals that work together on coffee see that organization and unity are needed. So this is one of the quotes from this other man. If you're not, no. If you're only one, no. If there weren't others, like he couldn't even conceive of it. He's like, no, there has to be others. And so this notion of collective organizing is not necessarily typical in today's individualistic world. But in this way, this characterized how the group adapted to climate change. And as a result, in the late 80s, they had started a cooperative for fair trade organic coffee. And so that cooperative became their key response to change in general, definitely now also climate change. And so they would describe, if we have fair trade certification, we earn more from our product. And for the small producer, that gives us many other opportunities to look for markets and training and so forth. So structurally, the belief that began just as a belief actually ends up kind of pulling through experience into a manifestation like this. So that when there's suddenly a pandemic on top of all these climate changes that are hitting the coffee farms, they have a structure through which they can actually leverage greater equity and greater communication and greater trust. So my last two slides here, this one is I just want to briefly say that what I just presented isn't your typical adaptation. Typically, adaptation can stay quite practical and quite technical and quite individualistic. So in this other region of Guatemala where I was working, the typical response to climate change was to meet it individually with more technology, with more financial resources. And that is your typical approach to adaptation. What was interesting is that these producers as well, despite having more access to resources, despite having more access to new varieties of coffee trees, they also were finding limits because they truly didn't know what was coming next. And that final quote at the bottom there. The truth is, we don't know what's coming next. We don't know what resistance we'll need to be selecting for and planting for next. So very interesting to see how their belief too had manifested in their approach to adaptation, and yet they were kind of coming to the edges of it and wondering what might be next in their own case. So just to conclude here, what kind of an issue we believe climate change to be relates with what kind of adaptation we engage. So in these two communities that I've presented, one I've said more than the other, but in the first one that I presented, the belief that collective organizing mattered and that personal resilience is important, and actually turning toward what is it I believe about climate change and making it an object that they could understand and look at, help them, characterize adaptation through these different responses to change. In the other community, climate change was mostly seen as a problem to be solved with technical or monetary inputs. And as a result, climate change adaptation remained largely practical, largely technical. So if we just land this a bit, and then I'm going to hand it over to Anne, what can I do? What is all this? What are these stories from Guatemala? How does it relate to us right now? And I think how it relates is the following three things. Surfacing your belief and reflecting on it and discussing it helps you decide if it's what you actually believe. And you can be more choiceful and more conscious about that, right? So becoming mindful of what you believe also helps you kind of be attentive to the social media landscapes that might be subtly influencing your beliefs in a certain direction or another. It's actually worthwhile looking at your belief and reevaluating whether it's still worth holding, because then you can kind of create a bit of space around whether or not you're being nudged one way or another based on your social space, or your, not just social media, but even your own echo chamber that you surround yourself with. So finally, this process of looking at, not through beliefs, is really important because they end up mattering. They end up actually manifesting. And so I hope that that's not too much information with not enough time to explain it all, but I'd like to pass it over to Anne, and I'm really grateful to have a chance to share some of these ideas today.
Great, thank you, Gail. Thanks so much. I think that bottom line that you know, we have to look at our beliefs rather than through them is so important right now, and that also your work really shows that how different worldviews and different relationships with each other really do matter as well. And I'd like to just kind of follow this thread through and present introduce Anne Caspari, who is a transformational change and leadership coach with EZC Partners. And I've known her for a number of years, and she's working with sense making and with the sense maker tool, which is kind of following on meaning making. It's really how we sense into the moment and can actually like become aware not just of our beliefs, but how they play out in our micro narratives. So Anne, welcome and start your talk.
Thank you so much, and greetings also to many of friends and colleagues I see on the list. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And perfect segue from both of you, also from your last slide, Gail. That was perfect. I do work with beliefs, but maybe in a little bit of a different context, much like the one slide you showed, Karen, with that quote about, you know, when we hold our assumptions long enough, that we don't notice them anymore. Because what you've a little bit been talking about, there are at least three types of beliefs. And one of them is also belief systems, and we have talked about this. And the question that you mentioned, Gail, you know, that was put to Trump, it's interesting because I heard, I think it was at the climate change conference in Oslo, Karen, when what's his name, Paul Hawkins says, you know, if somebody asks you, do you believe in climate change? That's actually kind of like a trick question, because what they're pointing towards is that climate change is a belief system and not science, you know. So they put this into that realm of beliefs that is nothing solid, that can be changed, and into that whole thing without even you noticing, you know. Then your answer, yes, I believe in climate change, but it's still in that kind of corner of a belief system next to you believe in God, you know, or believe in something else, you know. So becomes a personal opinion and a belief in that kind of maybe something spiritual or you know, can at least be discredited in a way. Yeah, so that's the one thing that we talk about belief. And the other way is talk about, you know, I believe it will rain tomorrow. So it's a way of speaking, or I believe in what I'm doing. So I can talk about beliefs in the way that I'm conscious about my beliefs. You know, maybe it's just an opinion, I'm just expressing opinion. Some people use different language. They say, I think. They're more the thinking logic types, you know, they're more the belief types, and they express their opinions like that. I believe in this, I don't believe in that. And what we talk about is actually neither of the two. Yeah, but it is really something that you said, we're hinting towards a little bit, Gail, in your work on meaning making and integral theory. You know, it's like in your meaning making system when you grow up, what beliefs are you so identified with that you no longer see them? That means really you see through them. Rob Keegan calls this assumption, the deep assumptions that we hold without noticing. And that's actually what's determining a person, how a person shows up in the world much more than anything else. Yeah. So if you say, oh yeah, I believe in my personal space, I believe I have to work in order to get noticed, or I believe I'm not good enough. You know, we're still talking about a belief that you're more or less aware of, yeah, and that you have worked on, or you think at least you should work on, and that's something you're already looking at. You know, I take your distinction about looking through belief or looking at. What I'm talking about, what is really fundamental to our work here, is those beliefs that you don't know, that you're deeply identified with, and you're not aware of it, and all your conscious efforts go in a different direction. Yeah, Karen, maybe if you pull up that quote again or you can't show it while I'm talking probably, but it's like if you're identified long enough with one of these assumptions, or maybe you can put it in a chat. It's really like that Buddhist joke, you know, it's like when the old fish comes and says, hi guys, how's the water? And the young fish turn around and said, what water? You know, it's like gravity. You no longer, you're not checking if gravity is there on a Monday morning. Yeah, you build your whole meaning making around the fact that there's gravity. The same with a belief. If you're completely identified with, then you don't check anymore. It's in the background. Your whole meaning making is based on that. Yeah. So these are, if you have limiting beliefs like that, you can fight against that your whole life and struggle and have a double PhD and still know in a way that you're not good enough, you know. So these are the beliefs that are important. It's important to be aware of what you're not aware of, in a way. So let's start with a nice paradox then. So this is the deep transformation work that we've been doing for the last almost 20 years to get people to find these beliefs, and that's also some of the work that Robert Keegan does with his immunity to change process that some of you know certainly, to identify these early mapping errors in your meaning making system. So maybe you have mapped, if the meaning making system, you think of it as a mapping process, you maybe have mapped being liked onto compliance, or being liked onto the opposite. You know, it's like being noticed, or any of these kind of like in your personal meaning making system. And that's like a wrong mapping error, but it became so loaded with importance, maybe most of the time something you were holding existentially true, it becomes both hidden and protected. So it takes really some awareness based techniques and some effort and some willingness to go through all that protection mechanisms that your whole system says, don't go there, don't touch it. We need to find these beliefs and then integrate them. Yeah. The point of all this is, if you're sitting on one of these big assumptions or hidden transparent beliefs, your conscious efforts can be absolutely of no or little success. Yeah, when you're sitting on one of these beliefs that is sabotaging or limiting. So it's even more fundamental to be aware of what you're normally not aware of. But the good news is it's workable. You can identify them. And then everything changes from here in the personal, and that brings us straight to personal agency. That you can work with that kind of, in the integral theory, call it shadow work. In other disciplines, we call it a little bit different. Integrity work would be another word for that kind of stuff. And that is deeply, deeply rewarding work. So, and it has to do with the personal agency, because if you're sitting on a belief, and that's especially for women, for example, it's like, oh, I can't do this, or I'm not good enough. There's some cultural influences for these kind of also of early indoctrinations that we received in our growing up, in our meaning making system. No amount of personal work or let's say efforting makes up for one of these, or like an entangled set or cluster of these beliefs internally. So everybody comes along and says, Karen writes a book about this, like, you matter more than you think, you have agency, come on, let's do this together, and it gets sabotaged by some of these unconsciously held beliefs and holding you back and going into more despair or into more, we can't do anything about climate change, you know, and then you have a look at the collective. But again, the good news is you can work on that and actually create an incredible agency with that kind of awareness and working on that. So that's the personal realm, more or less. And I assume there are a lot of questions also about this. Then there's the collective realm. And Gail, you were really nicely depicting both, and lovely example that you set there is what I found out in my studies is I did a lot of work on the personal and individual change, and also some work with group processes. And already from personal to group, they're different. The process looks different. And then if we go collective, like a community or an organization, then that change process changes again. There are different laws and processes and different containers and different, it just looks different, and it follows a different path if you, that kind of transformation from the individual to collective. For example, in the collective, I don't have necessarily a container. Yeah, for that change process to work with beliefs. I can work by what you did by awareness raising, you know, through the photos, through reflective issues. But if we want to go into larger scale movement or larger scale social change, we cannot really say. And that's been the conundrum also with the IPCC and the reports that we read. And it's like, we can't really say, look, here's the information, we should all change, or you should all change, and it works like that. So, because in the collective, I don't have that mandate. Yeah, I don't have the mandate to go out and change people. Yeah, they, you know, if an individual, they come to us and say, please, you know, I've been frustrated with this behavior, or I always run against the same wall. Please help me have a look, looking, yeah, and not through, but at. That's the subject-object move that Keegan talks about. In the collective, that's not the case, and yet. We work with sense making. That means my working definition of sense making is very easy. That means being able to process what's going on in the world in real time in order to be able to act. Yeah, and that sense making at the moment is really challenged because there's so much happening and so much, you know, fake information. So. So I work a lot with Dave Snowden's company, and also a tool called SenseMaker, and what they do is gathering micro narratives, much like you do, Gail, with your photo stories. And what's great about this gives you a little starting point of where people are at. What are the stories? What are the fears? What are the ideas? What are the frustrations? What are what are people talking about? What captures their minds? And you can find out through collecting these micro stories. And then you kind of like have these people signify their own stories in a process through a software. I don't want to go there. The point is you find out where people are now, not where they should be. What do they grapple with now? What is capturing their imaginations or their fears or something like that? And then you can go about it and say, okay, what can we do now, or at least tomorrow, to have more stories like these and less like those? Yeah, and you go about this micro shifting a whole community or a whole part of an organization into a direction that is considered generative. Yeah. So for me, the fascination is then change works in a different way. It works through the story you told, Gail, with that woman and the hole in the ground and the composting. Imagine that little example by the power of n, yeah, or by the power of x, yeah, that you can shift a whole culture if you, okay, again, a working definition is the sum total of all behaviors and of all interactions in a network or in a community. That is culture. Culture is reified. It's not a thing, yeah. But that makes culture. And if you can work with changing the constraints to enabling constraints, enabling more and more and more a more generative behavior, then looking back, something's changed. Yeah. So you don't treat people as objects of, you know, you should all change and you should be all at a certain level of consciousness. So you can induce that kind of awareness, but giving them the power of choosing what they want to have a look at, which you actually did, Gail, in your project, this wonderful example. So I'm very fascinated by these two approaches. In the personal, it's a completely different process. You know, finding my hidden assumptions and beliefs and working on my personal agency. In the collectives, works quite different. And if you put the two together, you work, of course, on consciousness still and on finding that personal agency, but you can scale agency in a different way by working with sense making, by allowing people to contribute. They don't need to jump through any loop of awareness training or something like that, just by how you ask them. Through photos, through storytelling, they become aware of something small changes, yeah, and the sum total of all changes. This is what how we can scale change in a very ethical way. And
thank you, and we're gonna have to like
I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, but I think that what both you and Gail are saying, I think is really critical if we're going to be even talking about quantum social change more than just a quantum blah, blah, blah gimmick, that we actually have to think about, you know, what does this mean in practice? And that idea of actually like doing that, you know, being able to look at our beliefs becomes really important. And I read an article in the New York Times today that was referring back to a study in the 70s saying that people's beliefs just never change. They are the way they are. And I think that there's a lot of, you know, what you're saying, what Gail is saying is that reflection process can do that. And when we get to, and this chapter kind of builds the case for looking at quantum social change, that we are entangled through meaning making, through language, through our actions, through what we do. And I haven't been able to follow all the chats in the group, but I see that there's, you know, the emotions come in there, like grief and anger and things that keep us, you know, that we actually have to address in the moment, right here and right now, as part of that sense making process, I think. So yeah, so Leonie, I'll pass it on to you because I know that we want to get into the groups and everything.
Yeah, thanks. Just before we do, we thought we would speak to Tone Bjordam, who's the artist who did the illustrations in the book, and maybe take a few comments from some of the people in the audience as well. Tone, are you there?
I'm here.
I just wanted to share the screen and show your beautiful artwork and just ask, you know, like, this is the artwork that you made for the Beliefs Matter chapter.
Yes.
And can you tell us a bit about how it links to the chapter?
Just hang on. I was.
Do you see it?
Yeah. Yeah. So these drawings that I made of clouds that looks a bit like animals or whatever you choose to see in them. It can be animals, it can be some other things as well. I just think of these clouds as great example of ideas, and that human perception and also human imagination comes through in a very nice way. when you look at things and then you imagine that you see something else in them, that you get an idea and visualize it, and also that you might see what you want to see, or that you get an idea because you're open to impulses and inspiration that you experience through your surroundings, dreams, imagination. That you can visualize a world in the clouds means that you can also visualize a world that is more sustainable, greener, environmentally friendly, and that you can visualize it to be different and tell other people about it, even though it isn't like that yet. And then they might believe in your vision, and it's easier to work for common goals then. So the figures in the clouds is a simplified version of that. It's like, and also these, when you look at the images on the side, so I take a lot of photographs in nature. I collect patterns a lot in nature by drawing or also by taking photographs. So all these images is from outside my studio. And if you look at the clouds, you can see some of the same figures, like the frog-like, or some people see a fox. I used these images because if I just draw something in the clouds that should look like something, I like it to be in a way that it could look like, for someone else, that it could look like something else, you know, that you have this freedom in the drawings for people to interpret, to see whatever they would like to see. But yeah, so it's an image that might remind people of what they would like to believe in. You know, it's like an illusion.
Thank you very much. Karen, is there anyone else we would like to invite for a comment before we move on?
I think it might be good just to go into breakout groups and then get comments, because I think that everybody has like a relationship to beliefs and especially how we relate to people that have very different beliefs with us at this time, and how we can actually overcome that. And as Tony just showed, see the possibility and potentiality in every moment to actually shift conversations.
So if we now split into groups of 4 for around 15 minutes, and I'll post some questions in the chat. Karen, would you like to read them and just sorry, I'm just
yeah, if you could put them in the chat, because these were from the at the end of every chapter, there are just some reflection questions to get us to think about this. And one of them I just mentioned, the second one is, how do you connect with people who don't share your worldview or beliefs, which can be, you know, how do we find, not just like make a connection, but recognize our connection? And the first one is, have you ever shifted your own beliefs? And maybe talking about an experience when your beliefs shifted around something that you previously accepted as normal. And I think this is something, you know, just as Anne was talking about, reflecting on those previously unseen beliefs, and what Gail was talking about through talking about our beliefs. So yeah, so we I think just to think about that, and think about it in the context of, you know, how do we collectively get to this stage of where we can actually consciously influence the future right here and now and now and now, and really think not in a linear deterministic way, but in terms of quantum social change.
Thanks, Karen. So I've just created the rooms now, and I'll open the rooms up, and for 15 minutes we can discuss these questions that I've posted in the chat. Okay. I think we've got everyone back now. Should we open up the floor for some discussion and questions?
Yeah, that would be great. Maybe just some people sharing from what came up in their groups, but also just perspectives on what, like the idea of why beliefs matter, and the challenges of, you know, meaning making and sense making at a time when polarization is increasing, at yet a time when we really need a very different approach to social change if we really want to succeed at meeting, you know, and I know that in the chat box there's like, yeah, we are going to see losses, we're going to have to deal with the grief and things, but that be able to hold that hope and the belief, you know, a very sure a belief that we know that we can do better. So I don't know if there people want to use hands, or if Anne, have you been looking at the
raise hand function? Or Anne, did you have any questions that you wanted to? Oh, you're muted, Anne.
Is it me or is it Anne Caspari?
Yeah.
One thing that came up in our group was this idea of people becoming aware that they are trying to look at their belief. But one of the people in my group was saying about how in North America there is this sort of long-standing narrative and a set of beliefs that have gone with that have existed right from when people moved into the continent, and the stories they had to tell and the things they had to believe to be able to colonize it in the way they did, and that's so embedded that the process of working with that collective narrative is a big task, and looking at how you would actually start to shift that. But that was fascinating to hear that.
Does anyone else want to add
to that? I was just going to add to that last one. I mean, we did a counter-narco project in Mexico, which was a micro-narrative one. And we were working with American consultants, and it was fascinating to see the cultural difference. So their belief about the way you handled narcos was to have male superheroes beat up. Yeah, you had a vision of a future which was drug-free, and you had male superheroes who kind of like beating them up. If we looked at the Mexican narrative, which we got through children, basically there was no focus on the future. It was always the past and the present. So if you didn't change people's vision of their history, you couldn't change the future anyway. Yeah, and actually the only superheroes were single women because the drug barons wouldn't touch them. Yeah, and that was fascinating because, of course, the American culture is based on we want to become Americans. So it's about we want a different future. Yeah, and it's actually culturally monotone, even though it's ethnically diverse. But we couldn't get the American consultants to work out the difference. Yeah, and it was fascinating to watch it because we ended up with telenovelas, yeah, which were you know, a woman whose husband had been killed by the drug barons with 5 kids as a police sergeant, and that actually made a difference. Yeah, whereas the male superhero wouldn't. So those sort of cultural divides, and the American trope, yeah, which is all about visions and heroic leaders, which goes back to the foundation of the country, is kind of like a real problem when you're dealing with things like Trump.
Very cool, thanks.
And that raises that question of like whose visions count, and you know, like if people don't even have visions, how do you actually activate like that visioning process for people so that they can see the potentiality that exists, or alternatives and things from that world of the here and the now or the past. So yeah, really interesting.
Would anyone else like to share? You can raise your hand or. Karen, we had a question. Oh, Sashiko, yeah.
Hello. Maybe I can just share what I was thinking when listening to my when the others were speaking in our group, and it did strike me that the social context that you are in. So this is what Sophia was mentioning about when she moved to a different city to do studies. And the norm was so different that sustainability was valued in the university. There's people had different, I guess, attitudes and behaviors around sustainability, and that she became vegetarian. So I think this was a kind of a story that I could also relate to, how that kind of social context, or if you want to say it the other way around, like the peer pressure, how that is actually really it really relates to what has been talked about today about how the individual is not an isolated being, but we're really influenced by the people around you. And I think that's really powerful and encouraging to me. But on the other hand, I was starting to share my own experience, and I got cut off because the time ran out. But I was sharing my own experience, how my values and a lot of people's values around me changed when I was in Japan when there was a great earthquake in 2011. And then suddenly you kind of felt that, okay, well, these kind of disasters would never really happen to you, but it happened. And then you're like, okay, well, actually we might just suddenly die sometime. And that really changed how people around me, how they wouldn't really postpone what they wanted to do. And instead they just start doing it right away. So that was kind of just two different stories I wanted to share.
That's great. And I just want to add to what you're saying about the how important context is. And in some of the methodologies that are building on just like the quantum equations and things like quantum decision making, they allow preference reversals. They allow context to actually change people. It's not just everything is a cost benefit analysis based on expected utility functions or things like that, but it's like, we actually influence each other and can change in the moment. And I think that that's really an exciting, that is reality as we live it, that we are constantly being influenced by others in the social context.
Karen, a question from Christina Wamsler for Gail was that Gail mentioned that beliefs matter because they tend to realize, and the belief carries through to an actual action. And she says that these are in a sense quite spiritual statements. Does anyone have any academic articles that support these statements, or is there any reading that you can recommend, either Anne Caspari or Gail or yourself?
I can speak to that. I didn't know that comment was for everyone, so I had responded just to her. But I'd be happy to speak to it briefly. The notion that I was speaking about there comes from an author called Ken Wilber, who is referring to enactment. So this idea, but it's not just him, he's drawing it from a lot of other places. And I'd be happy to trace back some citations. But the idea being that your paradigm has you carry out certain social practices, and that actually has the words that Karen was using is participatory realism. Like, it actually enacts ontologically the world spaces that we then think are given, but they're really not given, they're enacted. So this is a whole kind of body of philosophy, really, that's not so much it's not overtly spiritual in any way. I mean, you can come at it, I believe, from a spiritual approach, but it's philosophical more than it's spiritual. And it's pretty well developed as an area of philosophical inquiry. So maybe I'll leave it there. Karen, do you have any other thoughts?
Well, I think that just even Mark Johnson's work on the mind in the body, how we embody our thoughts and things, and it affects our way of being and our effect and everything. So I think there's a lot in the environmental humanities and cultural sociology that it's all aligned. And I think as I've been working on this book, the more I just am aware of or thinking about this, the more I see how many people are just saying the same things or have been saying the same things for 100 years through different lenses and through different ways of approaching this. So it's, I think it's to whatever is called spiritual in some places, it's just subjectivity or our circles of care. There's so many different ways of languaging it.
Other questions you'd like to address, Karen? There was quite a good one from Andrew earlier.
Could you repeat it? I haven't been able to follow all the chat.
Yeah.
I see Mauricio has his hand up as well.
Oh, sorry, who? Oh,
Yes,
I'll just ask Andrew's question from earlier. it was when you were mentioning Jem Bendel and the deep adaptation. How can we both reckon with the incredible destruction and suffering we're causing and will continue to cause, and harness the power of the fact that we simply can't know the future and open ourselves to quantum possibilities?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think it really is about being able to hold that paradox of like both and, you know, like to say that like, wow, we are losing things, and to really deal with the emotional states so that we can actually be present here and now, and actually, but at the same time, constantly looking at our beliefs and seeing like what is the potential for that next step. And I think that with like what Anne Caspari was saying with like the sense making of being able to look at those like what's happening right here and right now and nudge it in the right direction in that. So it's asking a lot of people, you know, a lot from people in order to, you know, it's a huge challenge. And I think that in my group, we were talking about just bringing in into teaching. I was talking with Kathy Day, who teaches in Florida, and she was, you know, just saying that, you know, she's been introducing Joanna Macy's work into her courses, so that to help people to be able to hold, you know, the losses and the emotions, but also move forward in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone has anything else.
I think Gail would like to add.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing there, and that's that my sense of this is that as you know, as those emotions are uncomfortable, there's a constant subtle turning away from them and avoiding it. And so in that space, other things can colonize. And so in that space, you can cultivate denial. You can cultivate, you know, some politically motivated concept because you've just subtly ignored what actually needs to be turned toward. And that's where I think Anna Caspari's work is just totally brilliant, because it kind of
the shadow work.
Yeah.
I see Jonathan has his hand up. Jonathan, would you like to?
Yes. Hi, good evening. Thank you. Fantastic discussion. Hi, it's Jonathan here from Johannesburg. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just was trying to put a spotlight on you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you got me. Sorry, I've mixed a picture with the leopard in the back, and it's got some virtual effect. I can't switch it off at the moment.
It's not your spots then.
Thanks. I was just two comments. I think the person's on the speaker, and yeah, you said something about aware of what we become aware of what we're not aware of. And I'm reminded of a Pali word I picked up to the Buddhist adventures I went through, was ajiva, this sort of spiritual ignorance that you get to experience through a meditative, retreat. You become aware, of how much is there as ignorance, spiritual ignorance of this this awareness of the self that is actually, that can change. It's not something that's fixed. And I think that's sort of the entity that generates the belief. But anyway, we in our chat room, we were reflecting on how the pandemic brought in this reality that we believed in before, but we didn't really have any way of enacting it, that we all connected. And here we are, three people, complete strangers, talking to each other as though we knew each other for 20 years, And I think that's one of probably, maybe this is the thing, this is the moment, this pandemic is the thing that's going to shift this trajectory that in the paper that was quoted towards the end of one of the presentations, is that there's no legislative tolerance for or allowance for changing the trajectory of about 4 degrees. Maybe this would be the thing that would get people to bring into awareness that we are connected, that the biodiversity belongs to everyone, the wildlife and in Africa, you are dependent on it as much as everybody else living in here. And it's just a sentiment or a comment that came out of the discussion that we had.
Thank you.
I saw we only have a few minutes left. Karen, is there something you'd like to share? I did see there was one other person who had their hand up, Mauricio, but I'm not sure if we have time, or should we?
we could probably take one more
One
question or a comment or like feedback from the groups, because I think that was really, like Jonathan, that was really insightful about, how COVID is actually sometimes it takes as we heard, like an earthquake or something to actually influence things. But again, can we do this before like the biggest, all the tipping points and disasters? And that is really what deliberate transformations are about, is to, to recognize what's coming and avoid them. So challenge.
Maurizio, would you like to talk?
Well, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Very fast. I just thinking about how I think one important dimension of belief systems are achieving well-being, personal and community speaking. But there's always a competition between, inside this discussion, because I think we should discuss more about competing beliefs and competing well-being achieves, because at the end we can also say that if what I'm getting is what I is in line with what I believe, and other people is getting the same, we both are we are good. But we cannot forget that sometimes, when all the time, cultural and political and other dimensions interact and affect what people is believing. So objectively speaking, maybe I'm doing best than others, or others are doing best than I. So we shouldn't speak very like even with that. I mean, we know for fact that results are not until now very equal. Talking about justice, talking about many other social important issues in society.
Yeah. Wants to quickly respond. We only have a few minutes left, so we have to wind up. But Karen, did you want to respond to the things?
What Mauricio was saying, I think that those are really, like, from what I the way I interpreted it was that that we have all these competing. We are collectives, and we have competing beliefs and competing ideas of what the good life is, what is valuable, and it's not just neutral. It comes from we are politically organized and cultural, and I think that is where in our group we discuss not just the competing beliefs, but how to connect with what matters to people at the very like basic level. And I think that and to meet people through that space of connection, like the what Jonathan was talking about in like meditative spaces, the I-we space, that space of oneness that applies to everybody, and that is very coherent. And I think that that's a challenge in practice, because we're so focused on the competition of beliefs and where we disagree and what we don't agree with, and that it's so easy to get polarized rather than to actually like be able to like transcend that and feel that connection. And I know that that's why when people say like, well, what does your book mean in practice? And I think that it just really means that practice matters, like just to at the very end of the day. And I don't know if Anne and Gail, if you want to comment on anything. We're out of time, and
we are, yeah.
Oh, good.
But should we bring Anne Pender on to just
yeah, why don't we bring Anne to wrap?
Anne, would you like to talk about?
Thanks, Leonie. I just want to say very briefly, those of you who've been on previous webinars will probably have heard me say this before, but what we're trying to do with Karen's book is build a bigger initiative around it, and we're calling it the Quantum Leap. And really what we want to do is grow the message of the book, firstly, and we're doing that through the webinars like these. We have a website, youmattermorethanyoutthink.com. And to put out the ideas, we're having pages on beliefs matter, that was coming soon, on agency matters, practice matters, and just putting some ideas there and some resources for people to start engaging with these ideas a little bit more. And we also have practice matters, which is good too. And also what we want to do is to connect people who are working with these ideas of quantum social change in related areas, to connect them, to showcase some of the initiatives that are happening. So we're hoping to get some kind of initial network going in the not too distant future, and we'll hopefully be emailing people about that. But also we're very interested to hear from people of examples that you have in your work, things that you're doing, things that you're hearing about. Please do let us know, because we would really like to hear about that. And also, on a very practical note, if anybody has ideas or contacts of publishing companies or agents that you feel might be interested in the book, we would love to hear about that too.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anne. The next webinar that we're going to be running next month will be on relationships matter, and we'll be exploring the particle duality in relation to the individual and collective action. And we're going to be joined by marine social scientist and big wave surfer Eski Britton. And if anyone has feedback on the book, we're really happy to take that in. And Karen, I'll pass over to you to thank Anne and Gail
I'd like to thank Anne, Gail, Tona, and all of you for coming today. And I really think these are valuable conversations to have at this time. And I really have appreciated feedback on the book and ideas. I'm going to sit down in November and revise it because I've gotten so much input, and to see what works, where I need to go with this. And as an inquiry, I feel like I could continue inquiring for the rest of my life, but I just want to finish this. And I really hope that we can actually create that, actually actualize quantum social change metaphorically, meaningfully, and really in the decade that matters. So thanks a lot, and I hope to see some of you back in November, and we'll be in touch.